On to our next panel. Next up, in this panel discussion, we aim to answer the question, how can better data collection help make women and their work more visible? In this conversation, we are joined by Dr. Pronab Sen, who is currently a professor at the Indian School of Public Policy, formerly the Chief Statistician of India, and also the Principal Economic Advisor for Government of India's Planning Commission, as well as the Secretary of Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. He will be accompanied by Sabina Dewan, who is JJN's President and Executive Director. So can we welcome them with a round of applause?
So this is working. So again, thank you all for being here, everyone who's sort of braved the post-lunch lull that usually happens. Thank you for being here. And the previous panel is a reminder for why we do what we do, right? And it is my real pleasure to welcome Dr. Pronab Sen here with us today. Apurva has already done the introduction, but I will add that Dr. Sen, in addition to being a professor at ISPP, is also a professor at the Vedika Scholars, and he is also an advisor for the Center for Gender Analysis. And his long and illustrious career in public service is well known. And so it is a real honor and a pleasure to have you here with us. So I'm going to start with a question, just picking up off of the previous panel. Dharminder ji posed this question to me that मुझे समझ में नहीं आया मैम ने ऐसा क्यों किया. But as I said, it's a reminder, right? So I'm wondering, what was it that brought you to public service? You spent your whole life in this profession.
Look,
sorry, I caught you off guard.
No, it's actually pretty clear. I come from essentially a family of refugees. We came over from East Pakistan. And this country gave us home. It gave me a lot. And I was very clear, I had to pay it back. And I thought going into public service it was the only thing I could do given what my abilities were, to be able to pay back to the country what I had got from it. And that was my main motivation, and sticks today even. Because I don't think I've paid back enough yet.
Well, I would differ on that, but we're very happy to have you.
Pleasure. And
your contributions. So, given the very heterogeneous landscape of our country, we're marked by diversity in terms of caste, religion, gender identities. I'm curious about your assessments on the quality of the labor force surveys that we have and their ability to actually capture the heterogeneity of India's labor market. What is your assessment of the quality of our labor force surveys?
Sabina, the thing about statistics is our ability to collect statistical data and analyze statistical data is circumscribed by the resources it takes. And the resource is not just about money, it's partly about people, and it's mostly about the amount of time that's required to generate data. So when you're talking about diversity, we do capture some diversity. So in the sense that we do capture information separately for men, women, for religions, and for specifically scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But to go into the deeper depths of the caste system, to look at the schisms which exist in every religion in India, that is simply not possible because the amount of data you'd have to collect is so huge. Number one, it would cost a lot of money, and number two, you wouldn't get the data in time to do anything meaningful. It may take 4 or 5 years just to collect the data. So there is an imperative for being able to narrow the problem down in a manner in which data collection becomes feasible and useful. And that's the nature of the problem. So in a more homogeneous country, none of this would be an issue. But in India, it is an issue. We know there's a lot which is being hidden by the data. But the trade-off is not yet compelling. There are situations where it does become compelling, and we do try and take it up, but sometimes that's not possible. So I don't know if you know, in 2012, we had a socioeconomic and caste census, essentially to get a feel for the caste breakdown in the country. And we are now 13 years down the road. We still haven't been able to make sense of that information because the responses we got was almost every household defined its caste in a very specific manner. And there's an entire institute in Hyderabad which is doing nothing but trying to reconcile that with the broad Varna system. And it's taken them 13 years to do it. That is the way, the level of individualization that has taken place in caste is really quite incredible. We didn't know this. We thought maybe a couple of hundred. It runs into the thousands. So everything depends on what kind of granularity you would like.
And so what does that mean for evidence-based policy making, right? What does that say for evidence?
Well, we have to go by broad categories, right? Now, whether there is sufficient homogeneity within those categories is, I think, a genuine question. But I don't think asking the statistical system to handle it is the way to do it. It's better done through focus studies. So that the statistical system can be told that within these groups there are really compellingly important divergences which need to be captured. Then perhaps it can take it up. But it cannot be the first step.
And speaking of data that we don't have and the level of granularity that we don't have, when we talk about a lot in terms of structural transformation in India, structural transformation is essentially the movement of workers, the shift of workers from low productivity sectors into higher productivity sectors, essentially manufacturing or services. But we know that services sort of encompass a very wide spectrum of activities. So when it comes to women's work, we have women in domestic work, we have women that are, street vendors, from there to all the way to up to IT services, right? So there's a large spectrum. Is the shift of people out of agriculture into services always a structural transformation, right? That's one question. The other question I have is also, we talked about this a little bit this morning, that when we look at female labor force participation rates, they've actually increased since 2018 to now 32% in the last PLFS survey. And most of that rise is happening in agriculture, with women in rural agriculture. So what does that say about our structural transformation?
That's an interesting question. The increase in the number of women in agriculture can be seen in various ways, right? I mean, if you remember, Sabina, when was it? Around the turn of the century, 2000s, there was a lot of talk about feminization of agriculture. So we had a situation where increasingly men were moving out of agriculture, moving to urban areas. The women were staying back and taking care of the agricultural operations, right? It saw a certain amount of increase of women's participation in agriculture, not a dramatic increase. And what was happening there is that earlier men and women shared the agricultural work. With the men moving out, the women continued to do the work and did all of it. So the burden on the women of the work actually went up. But the number of women didn't change very dramatically because a lot of it depended upon the ownership patterns of land. Right? And then it kind of stagnated for a while. The shift of women into urban areas from rural areas has been relatively low in India. So you do have cases of entire households shifting, but that is quantitatively less than the number of men who move with their families staying behind. And so what you're getting is a redistribution of the distribution of the population across rural and urban areas. So it's not just feminization of agriculture, it was feminization of rural India. Right? And urban India was getting more and more sort of male dominated. Now the question is was this a good thing or a bad thing? At one level, it's a good thing, because women were getting a lot more control over their lives. They had a lot more agency in their agriculture and rural work. But what it also did do is that the urban areas started running into a bit of a problem. And so we have this peculiar situation where there was feminization in agriculture, but women's work participation rates in urban areas went down. So what seemed to be happening is that men were moving from the rural areas and taking up work that women had been doing before that. And so you get this very strange thing happening. And then you get the second interesting thing. Because in urban India, education was picking up very rapidly, both among men and women, especially among women, the employment of educated women started dropping. And that is still something we haven't been able to figure out. And that's what the sociology behind that is not very clear. But that did happen, it has happened. So if you're talking about a transition in terms of productivity, much depends on what you mean by productivity. So if you think about a woman who was working in the fields earlier with her husband, the productivity would be calculated by dividing the total production by 2 people. Right? Now the husband moves out, you're dividing it by 1. So on the face of it, productivity has gone up. Right? Except that woman is working twice as long. So the normal productivity measures don't work very well in a situation of this kind. So I'm not sure that we can confidently assert that a transition has happened.
And speaking of productivity, I mean, one of the things that, is very well known when it comes to women's work is something that you're also sort of getting to, which is that women's work and their contributions are overlooked in the kind of methodological approaches that we currently take, right? So what does it take to capture women's work appropriately and their contributions? And if I could, because we did have a little bit of this conversation before, but I know you have very interesting examples, but there are those who advocate for women's contributions being accounted for in GDP. On the one hand, that would inflate GDP numbers, but on the other hand, if you don't take some kind of that or a similar measure, we run the risk of actually discounting or not counting women's contributions. So can you tell us both about sort of the methodological approaches that are more appropriate in terms of capturing this kind of nuanced granularity of women's work and contributions, and also vis-a-vis the existing frameworks of GDP and so on that we have?
Well, unfortunately, it also then takes us to theory. And let me say something which could turn out to be very controversial. One of the fundamental principles, the pillars of economic theory is that beyond a particular income level, right, households value leisure. Leisure is a good thing to have. So as income goes up, you tend to value leisure and start having more leisure than before. Now think of this in terms of a household, right? Now the household has several members, and supposing that the household income goes up, the overall level of leisure enjoyed by the household should increase. The question, of course, becomes that the nature of the labor market is such, it may be impossible for both the husband and wife to have higher levels of leisure, right? Then a choice arises. Who should enjoy the leisure? And what economic theory would say, that's an intra-household decision. So if the woman now starts staying at home, clearly the household has decided that she is the one who should have the leisure, right? So economic theory says a woman staying at home is a good thing because that is a decision the household is taking. And the income is permitting it to happen. Okay? Then you ask the question, all right, what does the woman do while at home? How is her quote-unquote leisure time being spent? That is a far trickier question. And the only way we can answer that is by doing what are called time use surveys, which is you go into the field and you measure how a woman is spending her time. Now we've tried to do this, and time use surveys are notoriously difficult to do. The best way, supposedly, of doing it is to actually send a person to the household who stays with the household for 24 hours. All right? And meticulously records what household members are doing. That's supposedly the best way. But think of it in your own family context. If some complete stranger were to come and stay in your house for 24 hours, would you behave exactly the same as you would had you been by yourself? And I think most of us would say, no, we wouldn't. We would behave very differently. So are we in fact measuring the right thing? We do not know. The second way of doing this is through a questionnaire. That is, you go and ask the lady of the house what she did in the previous 24 hours. Right? It's not a bad way of doing it, provided that that woman has a sense of time. Does she actually have a little mental clock ticking along which says that in the first half hour after I woke up I did this, next half hour I did that, and so on? Quite often it doesn't. Time kind of dilates or contracts according to how busy you are. So it's a little inaccurate. The third is the most inaccurate, where you actually ask a member of the household to describe what every other member of the household is doing, has been doing, where you're really dealing with very partial information. Quite often, you're dealing with a sense of guilt, a sense of not having done enough on your own, and so on. That data is extremely inaccurate. So just doing a time use survey is difficult. And we've tried it a couple of times. The first time we tried was in 1999, and then we did it a couple of years back with mixed results. But at the end of the day, even the questionnaire approach, which is like the second level, didn't work too well, because what would end up happening is every time our field investigator went out to a household, the entire household would be sitting there. All right? Now that again colors responses. So we are not very sure about the accuracy of the data. But that's the best we've got. And having said that, the question that really arises, so if you look at the data that has come out, what it says, men spend about 2.5 hours of doing housework of some variety. Women spend about 12 hours, right? The question really is, are you comparing like to like? So the critical question to ask is, what is the person time that is required for all the housework to be done? And then ask the question, how is that being divided? Now, there are two different things. Because one, I think it was Parkinson who said, work expands to fill the time available. So if you do have a lot of time on your hands, you may simply draw out the process. If you didn't have that amount of time, you would probably have done it faster. And these are questions that are very difficult to answer because they are so personal. They're not generalizable in any sense.
Mm-hmm. And what about the sort of measurement of productivity? This is a great segue, right? Because the real question here is the measure of productivity. So, we're not measuring the effort that goes in. I mean, you had this great example of the water, so I'm trying to lead you to share that example with us specifically. What are we measuring here? What is the important thing to measure?
You see, the important thing to measure, what economics should be measuring, what all of us should be measuring, is how well off we are, both in terms of goods and services and satisfaction. That's what we should be measuring. Goods, services, satisfaction, all of them take a certain amount of effort. There's a certain cost that is associated with it, and that should be deducted from the benefits we are getting. So what economics tells you is very simple. Measuring the benefit alone is not enough. What you should be measuring is the cost as well. And it's the difference between the benefit and cost that is the net gain, which is what we really should measure. Right? Now, this is where it becomes tricky. So we are discussing about women's work. And I was giving the example and it's a very common example of women, going and walking an hour to fetch water. Sometimes walking 2 hours to fetch firewood, right? How do you value that work? The product in question is the water and the wood, right? That's what the household is getting. You can evaluate that product pretty easily, which is there is a price of water. In most places in India, the price of water is virtually zero. So if I have a tap which comes to my house, I don't even pay for that water. Well, some of us in urban India do. Rural India, nobody does. Right? So the water itself has zero value. But a cost has been incurred, which is the woman having to go out for an hour and walk back for an hour. You can impute a cost and say, this is a cost that the country is bearing, which it could have avoided by providing a tap. So it's not an addition to, it's not a benefit, it's a cost. It's a cost not just to the woman, it's to the nation. Because what is happening is a part of my labor endowments are getting used up in tasks which should not fundamentally happen. Yeah? Wood has the same characteristic. That the task of getting the wood would be measured in terms of the value of the wood had it been bought in the market. And you're going to get similar results. It's not as stark as water, because the price of water is zero. There would be some price that would be attached to it. So the question then arises, if the woman is doing this, right, what does it mean in terms of the family, the household's evaluation of that water or the wood? Supposing we say that the woman shouldn't do it and the man should, it doesn't take away the drudgery. It just shifts it. Right? Now, what it says in effect is perhaps we should spend as much time in measuring costs as we spend trying to measure benefits. We don't do enough of that. So the whole debate, I think, has degenerated into measuring the value of this 2 hours that the woman is spending. Yes, there is a value, but do you take that as a value to the household? Or do you take that as a value that has been wasted, which should not have happened? That is really the question. And if you frame it that way, the nature of the debate changes. So it's not so much a question of valuing the woman's work, it becomes a question of wastage of women's work. And that is a completely different discussion. And maybe we should start doing it sometime.
Well, I think that is critical because so many of us are constantly trying to find the economic arguments to underpin things that we know are social imperatives, moral imperatives, but also we know at some level are economic imperatives, but we just don't know how to make the case for it. Yep. And I think measuring the cost of not harnessing women's productive potential is, I think,
is really important.
Is fundamental.
Yeah.
Yes. So my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, is, you have been at the front lines of policymaking. And one of the questions that we're here to address today is, our contention is that we address a lot of the symptoms in terms of women's work and in terms of gender inequities, but we don't always address the causes, and that the causes come much earlier in the formulation and design of policies, regulations, budget allocations, schemes, etc. And I'd love to sort of hear from you what you think are the points at which those levers need to sort of be pulled.
Well, first we have to understand those levers. You're absolutely right. If you think about policy making, by far the best way to do policy is to identify problems, work out the causes, and fix the causes. That's the best kind of policy. More often than not, we don't know what the causes are. What we do know are what the problems are, right? So a lot of policy, in fact, skips that second step and simply tries to address not the cause, but the effect. But the effect. And let's say fix the effect, right? That's not going to solve the problem, because any policy of that kind, at best, is ameliorative. It is not structural. It's not really addressing the problem. Just trying to take care of it at the surface. Too much of policies of that kind, right? And I think the principal reason is either a lack of understanding or, even worse, a lack of agreement on what the causes are. And until we get a convergence on that, we're going to continue to have this problem. So getting to the causes is important. And as I said, getting to the causes through the official sort of statistical data collection mechanism is extremely difficult because these are so sociologically specific. It has to be done with micro studies. This is the stuff that sociologists and anthropologists should be telling us. And that's who we look towards. And, I spent 15 years writing India's 5-year plans. I spent a lot of my time talking with anthropologists, social anthropologists, and sociologists. And what was very frustrating is that these questions were not even there in their work plan. And I was not getting answers. And for 15 years, I didn't get answers. I just hope like hell somebody has answers today.
Thank you so much for
You're
that.
welcome.
And on that note, I would like to say that our next panel has a diversity of disciplines represented. My colleague and friend Matangi Krishnamurthy, who's an anthropologist, we'll have an economist,
Sorry.
we'll have a practitioner. No, but she's addressing exactly the kinds of questions that you're raising. So it's very heartening to know that we've shifted from that to today actually having people that are in sociological and anthropological professions that are trying to address these issues. So with that, I will stop.
Can I ask her a question before we open the floor?
She's fantastic.
Tell me something. Am I wrong? Because the sense I got was that sociologists and anthropologists were not interested in policy. They were looking at it much more in terms of a social approach to a problem, rather than a policy approach to the problem.
So, Dr. Sen, let me start by saying that you are not wrong.
Okay, thank God.
You are not. The difference might be in how those bridges have now come about, and I'll speak a little bit about that.
Good. Lovely.
But yes.
Thank you. So let's open it up for questions, if you'd like to. Sure. So can I start with the back and then come? Yeah, we'll come right. So I want to start at the very back. Sorry, I don't have my glasses, so I can't see. Is that Shreyana? Okay. Shreyana is also going to be on our next panel.
All right.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. I actually had a question which is somewhat adjacent perhaps to this conversation. I was curious for your views. We've been reading a lot since we're talking about women's work and statistics. There have been a lot of books out recently about the history of statistics in India. And you'll pardon me if I sort of say this, and it just sounds like a lot of men got together, Bong and Malu men, and then they made the statistical system. And I was...
It's still that. It's just a lot of Bong and Malu.
So I wanted to ask you, do you feel in this history, because now if you look at data journalism, women are some of the best data journalists, for example, we have right now. And a lot of the statistical production outside, at least the formal statistical services, women are very active. I was curious for your views on, should there be better histories of the way women have supported the statistical system in the past? Because we know right from the work of Professor Devki Jain, Nirmala Banerjee on time news and all that work. But where can that history come from? Do you think it's adequately represented?
I think, let me be very honest on this. This recognition has been around for many years, at least 50 years. The problem that we have had is being able to get enough women to join the system as investigators, field investigators. Right? So what we do have, and you're quite right, is in terms of the data that's been collected by academics, with absolutely wonderful fieldwork, these people are motivated, intellectually motivated, or whatever their motivation, they're motivated to go out and... But for women to join as field investigators as a profession, we found very difficult. Even after so many years, only 1/3 of the positions available are filled. And getting women has been impossible. So we get women, I know we have a lot of, in fact, now the new batches of the Indian Statistical Service are mostly women. Right? But at the field investigator level, nothing. And part of the problem, I think, really comes from what we heard in the last session, which is that families are insecure about the kind of locations at which they would have to go and work. And they're reluctant to let them do so. But until we fix that problem, everything else will have to wait.
Maybe we could take a couple of questions together, and then Professor Sen could answer. So, yeah.
My name is Sundar Singh, and absolutely fascinated and blown away by your revelations. I have never, I did see the Karan Thapa interview, and I'll probably watch it again. So thank you so much.
That's embarrassing.
But I mean, I'm not going to ask you a question on the GDP and stuff because I mean it's there in the interview. So please, all the people do watch it. But my question is rather, what are your thoughts on, let's say, if you were given the charge, let's say tomorrow, or maybe let's say a week or a year and a half, or whatever, if the government changes. What are your thoughts on how would you run if you were to integrated national development? Integrated national data system. And what are your thoughts on this new? I mean, some people have called it data as the new oil. What are your thoughts on the social contract for the data that we will end up generating?
Very good question.
So should we take a few of them?
No,
Okay.
on structural, because I'd forget this.
Okay.
And this is an important question, and I think you really should listen to. Let me outline the nature of the problem. If we want to do what we really want to do, and the kind of integrated data systems, it has to be bottom up. All right? You're going to have people who understand data and the data collection processes, because data is not any old number you pick up. It has to adhere to certain definitions and follow certain methodologies. All right? So you're going to need people at the bottom. It's possible to identify those and to train them. That's not, but that is something that originally it used to be the state governments would have to do. Now it's going down to the panchayat level. The question that you have to ask is, at which level of government does the importance of data kick in? And my answer to you would be, I suspect, not lower than the state government level. Even at the state government level, except for maybe 12 to 14 states, the rest of the state governments don't care about the data either. Now, unless that commitment to data and information is there at the panchayat level, it's not going to happen. And my suspicion is that in most parts of India, the panchayats represent an interest group where they will not allow this kind of data to be collected. Right? So that, I think, is a pipe dream. So we will have to settle for the data that can be collected from the center, or at best the state government level, where the degree of granularity is going to be much, much less than otherwise could have been. Does it answer your question?
Yeah. Okay, Raghav, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hello. I'll make it very quick. So there have been many estimates on, okay, if you bridge the gender gap in terms of employment and entrepreneurship, you will be adding this % of GDP. What does it really mean to say that? And if it has, I mean, if there is this kind of economic gain to be had, why has it not happened already? And if this were to happen, if this were to indeed happen, would this necessarily mean a redistribution of employment away from men?
Well, let me try and answer it. Most of these estimates are complete rubbish. Okay? What you're doing is you're taking the productivity of the average worker today and then multiplying that by the additional number of workers you would have if there had been gender parity. Right? And saying that much, you could get that much increase. It completely bypasses the question of where does the production capacity come from. If we had the production capacity, women would be working today. Right? The more interesting question is not that one. The more interesting question is that in a situation where in the working age group, you have about 90% of the men working and only about 30% of the women working, right? Clearly, there's a very large number of women who are far more skilled and capable than a very large chunk of men, what would happen if you substituted? That is, you kick out 30% of the men and bring in 30% of the women, so that both are at 60%. What would be the increment? And that would be the productivity difference between those two groups, which is the, so today you're really taking the best 30% women and you're kicking out the worst 30% men. Of course your productivity would go up, but we don't know how much. We haven't measured it that way. Okay? But those figures are complete rubbish.
I have a colleague in the room who I will not name, who very jokingly once said to me, and it was a joke, but he said to me, there's such a shortage of jobs. It's, thank God the female labor force participation is so low. What if they were all in the labor force? What would we do? And this person was joking, but I'm not naming him anyway. But he knows, you know who you are. Other questions? Yes, I'll take one in the back, and then you also had a question, so we'll come to you as well. So the one in the back first. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, ma'am. I am physical planning student. I'm a town planning student from School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. So I think more in the planning reforms. How can we make interventions in the planning of the nation? So I was thinking particularly in the education sector. We see the right now in the education system, when the most fields are dominated by the men in the society, the men have to enter after their education into male-dominant society, which is not a problem. But the female, on the other hand, have to enter into a male-dominant society, and there the lacunae of our education system gets into the play. Right now, we do not have any.
How do you think it gets into the way?
Because
I'm very curious to hear what your reason for that is.
Yes, sir. Because the skills like negotiation skills and the other skills that get to the higher pays are more on the male side. Like the female lack the particular those ones that they need.
Okay. I hope everybody's been listening to that.
Well, I've been listening very carefully.
Oh, good. Go ahead, please. Continue.
So, are there any reforms in the way we educate children that you have in mind, so that we'll be able to make gender responsive abilities, inculcate gender responsive abilities in the children, so that they get paid properly and they
No, we don't.
lead good careers?
No, we don't. And, you know, when I was being introduced, you were told that I teach at two places. One is the Indian School of Public Policy, and this other place, which is Vedika Scholars, which is an MBA program for women. The big difference I find between the two is that Vedika Scholars spends about 15% of its classroom time in training these girls how to operate in a male-dominated workspace. And they are just so much more capable than the ones which are coming out of the other side. But the question that you have to really ask, and this is a question that you and I cannot answer, because we simply will not have the perspective. We need some of the ladies here to answer the question. What is it about a male-dominated space that makes it difficult for them to operate? Because if we don't understand that, we can't fix it, either in terms of the training or in terms of the work environment. And we simply do not have that understanding. No, there was a comment that he wanted to make. He was very eager to pile onto it.
In the spirit of the room, I'll take it out.
Okay, all right, done. Yes.
And I think it's also worth pointing out that in the education space, we also have Mr. Anurag Behar, who works very hard to break down these gender normative stereotypes from very early education onwards. So maybe you could connect with the gentleman in one of the breaks. But over to you for your question.
My question here was a little, very inquisitive question of why SC, ST women are always put together in any statistics. I mean, why is it always said that the reservation is for SC, ST women?
No. It's not SC, ST women. It is the initial division is male, female. And then the next level of division is by religion. And then in the Hindus, you have the SCs and STs as a separate category. So the division is, the first division is between male and female.
And the women, SC, ST again?
All of them, the same breakup then takes place. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Just women, not SC, ST.
No. It's
Thank you
broken
for
up all
your
the way
question.
down.
Right.
So I think with that, Dr. Sen, I could keep you here for another couple of hours, but we also
But that
have,
was fun.
that, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it, and we hope you'll come back. And we're really
Sure.
delighted that you have agreed to be an advisor for us, which means we'll have a lot more opportunities to interact with you.
Yeah.
Very grateful, and we'd like
Thank
to
you so much.
offer you a little token of our appreciation from Nandini Jaiswal, and this is her own artwork.